Yeah, let's talk about Sachi Schmidt-Hori's book, Tales of Idealized Boys. Idolized, I wrote in the chat. Okay, I'm gonna change that. Idealized Boys. Just before I ask what you thought about it, let's summarize it a little bit for those who have not read it. It's a book about stories that featured so-called chigo, which was young boys who lived together with a high-ranking priest in a relationship for a few years, a transactional relationship where the boy was taught things and where the boy was the personal assistant to the priest and also the sexual partner to the priest. And these monogatari, these fairy tales, was about these relationships. So
like the ancient Greeks, right?
Yes, very similar to that and many other cultures. So that is, yeah, and in the book, Schmidt-Hori analyzes this
a little bit.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
The book does touch on ancient Greece a little bit, if only to highlight the differences between medieval Japan and Greece in terms of how they approached what we would now call homosexual relationships.
Yes, maybe it did. Yat, what did you think about the book?
I thought it was really good that it immediately touched on that there was a difference. There's this perspective that Western society has that if there's a difference in power between two partners, it must exist to control the inner self of the younger partner. And I like that it questioned that and then showed a bunch of stories wherein you got to witness a very complex negotiation of power wherein these chigo would get something out of the situation. They would have erotic capital, but at the same time there would be the cultural capital of their master and the political capital of their families, and these all interplayed to create circumstances where these relationships weren't manipulative attempts to control the inner self of a young person. They were just a mutually beneficial system in place for the benefit of everyone involved.
Yes, and what the author does is that she frames her whole research by saying that it would be anachronistic to apply our cultural beliefs on this thing, this phenomenon that happened 1,000 years ago in medieval Japan. And I think she does that very well, because in the 1950s and 60s, when research started on chigo monogatari, researchers, the academics, they were very homophobic in their interpretation of this, because back then in the 1950s in Japan, these relations were of course just seen as plain homosexuality, which had been controversial ever since the Meiji Restoration in 1868. But then, later on, which is now, these stories are not seen, or these relationships are not seen as homosexuality anymore. They are seen as child sexual abuse. And thereby, once again, academics feel the need to protest against them in a way that they would never do with other things like beheadings and disembowelments and other things in history that we might object to today. So I think that she does that really well. She argues for her sake that it's we must read these stories as they were written, read, and understood back then. And also, I
appreciate her framing of it as she has the perspective of her mother was a hostess, and seeing the power structures involved between her mom and the club and the clients.
I really like that too. Can you explain a little bit about it?
Yeah, so when you're a hostess in a Japanese club, at least as the way she described it, you as the hostess, you have clients. The clients see you specifically. They follow you from club to club if you leave that club. But at the same time, the club has an interest and it wants to get something out of the transaction between the hostess and the client. And all three parties want the arrangement to be mutually beneficial. But at the same time, it's easy for people who look down on that activity to go, oh no, the hostess is being taken advantage of. Whereas she seemed to have the perspective that no, these can be mutually beneficial if complex interactions.
Exactly. The power relationships are more complicated than the obvious interpretation. Yeah, so Schmidt-Hori had a mother who worked as a hostess, a single mother with 3 children, and who managed to earn enough money to send her daughter, then Sachi, to an academic career. So that is quite an achievement, and she writes about that at the end of the book too, that this is it's quite fantastic actually that she has managed to now write this book and spread her knowledge about Chigo Monogatari to the world and to academia. And yeah, that's I forgot what my point was there, but that's quite interesting actually. And yeah, I must say that I think that the book is so well written. What do you think, Jat? Because you must be a native English speaker, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think it does a very good job. I don't read a lot of academic books, particularly the main basis of comparison I have for how well it did at translating nuances of Japanese language and culture is from your book, Impossibly Cute Boys. So, I mean, it seemed to do the same job of trying to get across that, like, for example, gender and sexuality are the same word, say, and other details like that. And I thought it was very well written in terms of just getting across what it wanted to. I feel like if I wrote this book, I would be constantly raving about injustices in how these relationships are perceived, whereas she mostly saves it for the beginning and then the conclusion.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, the stories themselves, I mean, that's literary analysis and history. And they are, of course, super interesting to read. They are even entertaining. She makes these short summaries of each story first and compares them to other stories and also stories with heterosexual themes. I think that one point that she makes about this system, which she calls the chigo system, is that it was an institution. And an institution not that different from marriage, because it was an arranged system. A boy, and not every boy, by the way, a boy from a very well-off elite family would be a chigo for some years, 4 or 5 years, when he turned around 12 or something like that, and be together with this high-ranking priest during this time. So that was a way for that family to gain more influence in society, and it was a way to give the boy a head start in this elite society that he was part of. But it was, of course, not all boys that did this. You want to comment there, Jat, or someone else, by the way?
Yeah, it sounds different from the ancient Greek practices, because in the ancient Greece, as far as I know, it was more like generalized, more democratic. Like there were boys like from normal families, average families, that went to the agoge in the case of Sparta, and they had even like an eromenor relationships. But what well, from what I'm hearing, in Japan it was different, right? Like it was something for the elite by the elite.
Yes, exactly. Because, like you say, in ancient Greece, it was every boy was needed because it was also part of, at least in Sparta and among the Dorians, it was part of becoming a man who could fight in the army. But something that is similar is that in both medieval Japan and ancient Greece, it was a negotiation with the parents of the boy. So it was the parents who had sought out a good suitor for the boy. Right. But it is interesting because I think that the fact that chigo was not for everyone, that it was only elite boys who could become chigo, I think that puts even more the focus on this idealization of the boy, because it was not all boys, but it was these particular boys who were then groomed into perfection. So they had of course some biological capital to begin with, the corporeality as the author calls it. But then this corporeality, the boy of age 12, was sort of refined through makeup and through colorful robes and clothes. And most importantly, of course, through his hairstyle. And the chigo's hairstyle was a ponytail. And the hair was extremely important throughout all of medieval Japan. Did someone read about that and can explain?
There's a lot of good stuff in the book about the role that not only your hairstyle, but your outfit and your title indicated, not just as like signifiers or modifiers to some kind of internal truth about you, but which like actually defined who you were. For example, there is one story in which a chigo's hair is cut by his stepmother. And the author goes into great detail to describe how this isn't just like the way you would react to a relative cutting your hair in your sleep. This is a comprehensive reduction into, I think it was either the lower status of a woman or the status of a what was it? The outlaw class? The bandit class?
Yeah, exactly. The lowly servants of the outlaw class. Or outlaw, yeah, something like that.
There's a specific word that I'm forgetting.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Was Boryukudan or something like that.
No, I'm not sure.
Burakumin.
No, it was not the Buraku. That's something else.
Okay.
But it, yeah, I'm also searching for the word. I don't think it was outlaw, but it was something similar. Yeah, exactly. So I was also surprised that because this stepmother cutting the boy's hair, cutting off his ponytail basically, it's a fatal event because it means that the boy must now leave the court or whatever it was. So he actually escapes in the night because he realizes that if his priest sees him like this, everything is destroyed. And it should be the honor of the priest to cut off the boy's hair when that time comes. And of course, you can't just grow out a ponytail in half a year or even a year, or maybe you can, but not in a few months at least. So that's why this is so important. But I think that the hair was heavily regulated by the governments for about 1,000 years, from about 800 to 1800, and not only for chigo or children. The general rule was that as long as you're a child, you have longer hair and more unruly hair, and then when boys reach genpuku, the coming of age ceremony, that's when their hair is cut in a certain way. So children had either twisted, it's hard to understand all of this actually, but either twisted side locks or something like that, or forelocks. So forelocks is also called maegami, which is when the hair falls down like this, which is, by the way, still a marker of boyishness in Japan. The Japanese word for twink in the gay scene is maegami, because it means you're a boy, you have your hair forward. And just like in medieval times, even some gay men in their 40s can have a maegami because they feel boyish and so on. So the point that I want to come to here is that the hair was so symbolical. It was quite irrelevant who you were biologically, what gender or what age you were biologically. That was just the start. But what really matters was what you signaled through your hairstyle and other attributes. So hair would signal not only your age status, but also your gender and your occupation and your social class. And the author she mentions here that maybe the reason why the government controlled hairstyles so strictly was that people could be quite fluid when they just said that, okay, now I have this hairstyle, so now I am that. Which is quite fascinating. So not only by hairstyle, but also by what you called yourself. When the chigo became a chigo, for example, he got a new name. So if it was so easy to transcend through the roles, because everything is roles, well, then you can understand that it was important for the government to actually punish people who did that by just changing their haircuts and saying that now I am this. And there are several examples also of, in the stories, but not only in the stories that she analyzes, but also stories that she refers to, where men dress like women and where women dress like men and cut their hair. And how that sort of works, which is quite fascinating. I'm not sure if there are so many examples like that in medieval European literature, but there is in Japan. So there is a lot of focus on these roles and how easy it is to transcend them just by changing your markers, basically. Yes. And like I said, maegami, mae for front and gami for hair. Maegami, yes, that was one word that was used for boy, a person with forelocks. But there were other words as well, like for example, warawa and suihatsu, which both mean unbound hair, which children had, but it also means children. And also tsunogami, which means twin loops, and also child. And I was thinking about contemporary examples. We have Nigejozu no Wakagimi, the elusive samurai, who actually has a ponytail, so that's very historically accurate. I guess maybe he was a chigo. What do you think?
I haven't seen the anime, so I don't know.
This is a samurai with a ponytail?
Yeah, a young samurai with a ponytail, the elusive samurai. That's an anime that is screening now, I think.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Oh, okay.
That's interesting. Like, is it a full-length ponytail or a smaller one, or?
Haven't thought about it really, but it is a ponytail. And actually, even okay, so that is, of course, an anime that is about samurai and that takes place in this time. But I think even if we think more generally about Japanese anime and manga, I think it's quite common to sort of reference this historical period. And I realized that many characters that I've seen, like for example Hiei in Yu Yu Hakusho, well, okay, so he's called Hiei, and in this Chigo Monogatari, lots of stuff happens on Mount Hiei. So it feels like a reference. Also, Amidamaru in Shaman King. Amidamaru is the ghost of Yo, the samurai ghost. And then I also read here in this book that, what was it called? Amida something, or actually Amitabha, but also Amida, was the kind of prayer that the boy and the priest would say together in the morning, whereas in the evening they would have another prayer. So that was part of this whole process of preparing. But my point is that it feels like there is, maybe it's just a superficial connection, but it feels like manga and anime creators want to tap into this historical past or something like that.
I think that's an interesting angle to take on it. I worry I don't have a broad enough sampling of Japanese culture to be able to assess whether these connections exist. So it's interesting hearing your perspective.
What did you think about the last story? Because the last story is not about a boy and a priest. Actually, before I go into that, let me just summarize for everyone here that the general theme in these stories is that the boy, the chigo, has a master priest who he is supposed to serve. But the point with the stories is that someone else comes in, usually a younger monk. And this someone else becomes infatuated with the boy. And then the question is, will they pursue a relationship despite the boy belongs to this master priest? And they will, almost always. So that is that is the romance of it, the secret, their secret relationship, so to speak. And these stories were written by clergymen, for clergymen, for pleasure. At least that's what the author writes. And but she also writes that this chigo system was not unproblematic. It certainly had negative aspects, and but she argues that these stories sweetened the reality a bit. They made the chigo system seem nicer than it maybe was for everyone. And part of this chigo monogatari was also, part of the point was also to, because they take place in Buddhism and in Buddhistic monasteries, or in a Buddhistic setting, Buddhist setting. So part of the purpose was also to attract people to Buddhism, to attract people to this way of life. And I think it's so interesting that how should we attract people to our religion? Well, we can show them how boys, chigo, and priests and monks, what kind of beautiful relations they have together. That was their that was their biggest selling point. So yes, it was romantic and sort of sweetened stories, and although they were made for clergymen, they spread to the public. They became mainstream, but they weren't mainstream at first. And so yeah, there was an element of secret love between the boy and the monk. And she also hypothesizes that maybe these stories brought in a younger character, a monk, a younger lover, because the high-ranking priest was usually quite old, and people don't like seeing old people engaging in love relations with young boys. So they thought it was a way to make the relations with chigo seem more appetizing, to bring in a younger character who was still maybe 30 years old, but not 45 or something like that, maybe. So that was one idea, but these stories also follow a certain pattern, and almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them follow the pattern that the boy, spoiler alert here, the boy actually dies in the end. And that is because the boy was an incarnation of a bodhisattva. He was a bodhisattva, a little Buddha, a god in the flesh. So when the boy dies, it turns out that the whole purpose of him coming and serving this priest or monk was that the monk should reach enlightenment. Because after the boy dies, the monk is so devastated that he goes to recluse himself somewhere on the mountain or something like that, or he founds a temple on the mountain, and then he spends the rest of his life there reaching enlightenment. So that is kudos to the boy who made him do that. So that was also one of the purposes of this story structure. Do you have something to add, Jat, or someone else? I'm reading the chat here also.
I think it's fun to read these stories with the understanding that they were kind of an advertisement. It's very interesting to read the historical accounts of what the chigo system was like earlier on in the book, and then encounter almost immediately a succession of stories that all either belittle or poke fun at the master-acolyte relationship in favor of passing off the system as more equitable than it actually was.
Yeah, and good point also. They are very humorous, and they poke fun at the high-ranking priest. Go on, Jat.
I think it's interesting that these are sort of, there's part of it is called the Booklet of Acolytes, and that's a series of shorter drawings and stories, and it's sort of meant to relieve the anxieties of beneficiaries of the chigo system. So it had to perform both roles. It had to advertise, and advertise is the wrong word, but advertise the system to people who would spread the tale around, but also make the priests who benefited from this system, which was to everyone who didn't get their own chigo an unfair system, to make those priests feel better about their position.
Right. And also, Keyboard asks in the chat, was it really secret or more of an open secret that enhanced the eroticism? Right. Well, the question is whether these chigos actually had relations with monks that were not high-ranking, like their master was, or if it was just a facet of the stories that made the stories more appealing and more fun. So the last story that she analyzes is about a boy who actually dresses like a woman in order to pursue his love interest in some kind of court girl. And that was interesting because it's a heterosexual love story What did you think of that one, Yat, or someone else?
I was delighted that there was, how would I put this? I was delighted that this was sort of advertised, I'm using that word again, this was portrayed, the author states that this was very likely a work by women for women. And I think it's interesting to have that take on the system, that you would view it less as an exclusively male institution and just as a gateway to a cultural education that could prepare you for example, a life in court with a very high-ranking wife. I think that as a book, it's not as a book, as a story. I'm interested in the fact that it still pays heed to the sort of strictures of Chigo Monogatari. The master's relationship is kind of made fun of. He's shown as his master is shown as very attached to him, but they spend very little time together, and they're mostly just manipulating around his presence. And I think that I like that, even if it is a story meant to sort of appreciate the perspective women would have on this system, it still pays heed to what these tales are trying to do with and around the system.
Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of a story being written by women for women, which almost made me think of yaoi and similar genres, even if this is heterosexual. But I was thinking, that's quite surprising, actually, considering the patriarchal culture that medieval Japan was. And I would actually like to say that, or rather I would like to ask, what kind of culture was it that that had this chigo system, and where boys and women were sort of interchangeable from the perspective of the man? Well, the culture it was of course a very male culture. It was a patriarchal culture, and that's why it was the male gaze that mattered. But what's interesting here is that the male gaze looks with desire on both women and boys. And I think that's really interesting. And it's also not just any kind of boy. It is not sort of boyish boys, but it is boys who are androgynous and whose androgyny is enhanced through makeup. And it's almost as if the boy is considered almost a more refined version of the woman, because she even references Genji, the famous epos of Genji, which is a heterosexual love story, but it has some side story where the male characters say about several boys that I want to see him as a woman. I want to see what he looks like as a woman. And that is so fun, because it's it seems so fluid that you can be attracted to either a woman or a boy. But it also feels like a desire that is very far from, let's call it, gay male desire. And it feels like a very, if we're even supposed to use these terms, which is anachronistic, but still, it feels like a very straight male desire. And this is what I see not only in medieval Japan, but also in, like you said, Newton, in ancient Greece, and also, for example, in Afghanistan, the Bachabasi tradition of dancing boys. Actually, the chigo were also dancing for guests when the high-ranking priest received guests. So it seems it seems very similar to that and to many other cultures like the Abbasid Caliphate, and I don't know what China was in medieval times, but it feels like this is almost like a cultural constant, that it works the same way everywhere or in very many cultures that have been described. Do you have any comment on that?
I think Sorry, my mind wandered for a second because I was thinking about a segment of the book that I wanted to bring up. Could you say that again?
Actually, you can bring that up, but my question was, what kind of culture was it actually? Because what's so fascinating when you read all these Chigo Monogatari and read about the culture around them is that it's really hard to grasp how a whole country, a whole culture could so universally celebrate the beauty of the adolescent male. So what does that say about that culture, and what other examples do we have of the same? And my point was sort of a little bit that maybe this is universal, because there are so many societies that have celebrated the boy, but in slightly different ways, but also very similar ways. I guess if you wanted to comment on that, but otherwise just feel free to bring up what you thought about in the book.
It certainly, I just keep thinking that Japan as a society seems largely untroubled by Christianity, and that sort of distorts my entire perspective. Like, I don't know what to do with a society that didn't sort of ingrain shame in youth. At the same time, it tells me that this was a society that placed an absolute premium on the ability for people to become who they were through presentation, who did not have some sort of inner truth that revealed who they were, but who played and were allowed to play their part based on where they were in society, and who just everything in this society as medieval Japan is portrayed to me seems to be in flux. There are no absolutes. There are just moments in time where you can be something or someone else. And in those moments, people recognized the androgynous beauty of, say, 13 to 17-year-old boys and decided there was nothing wrong in elevating that as long as it continued to be an act of performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really at the core of it, the performance of these roles. And I mean, performance of roles, that's what queer theory is all about. That's Judith Butler's whole theory of the gender that is performed through repetitions and so on. So in that sense, it really feels like Japan is queer in the way that the Christian Europe never was, but which queer theorists argue that yes, everything is roles and everything is performed. But here in Christian Europe, that is still just a theory. And what I have theorized before is that the reason why queer theory never hit in Japan is that it was not needed, because Japan was already queer in that sense. They already saw the world as and people as consisting of various roles that are performed. Whereas in Christian Europe, that's where queer theory was needed in order to dismantle a belief that everything is essential, that gender, everything from gender to sexuality to other things as well, race and so on, that it is essential, and like you said, that there is an inner truth that you can either hide or reveal. But since that yeah, since that system existed here, that's why queer theory was needed to make us aware of that. That's why queer theorists were needed. But like I said, queer theory never hit, and it never became a hit in Japan. And I think that might be the reason that Japan is queer by design.
Yeah, also in Japan nowadays they have like some political groups who homophobic political groups, because what was seen before as sexual behavior is now seen as LGBT identity. You can see that in like far-right conservative groups in Japan, that they are against like LGBT marriage and so on, or against like anti-discrimination laws, because I think they see it as an identity, not as a sexuality. You know.
And you say that that doesn't hit home in Japan to see sexuality as an identity rather than behavior.
No, I mean that in Japan, before the Western influence, they don't see like someone who has sex with men like a gay person. They just see a person who
Right.
has sex with men.
Mhm.
This is something I think you talked about in a video called Gay Orientalism about
Right.
the Syrian Arabs.
Yes. No, that's very
Yeah,
true.
exactly.
This focus on sexuality as an identity is it's both very Christian European, very
Yeah.
medical, and it has a certain trajectory. Yes, you're completely correct about that.
Mhm.
And
The other thing I wanted to share, I have an image from the book. It's one of the illustrations.
mhm.
I just really appreciated that in this one part of the booklet of Acolytes, there's a drawing of a monk having relations with a chigo, and
Right, there it is.
he is blurred out. I think the textual reason is he's wearing a cloak of reeds, but his body and face are blurred out in almost the exact way that you will see the adult's face blurred out in Shota art.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating.
Which I thought is fascinating that this impulse existed even 500 years ago to create artwork that highlights one figure while admitting that the other one doesn't matter as much.
That's fantastic. Yeah. What an elaborate technique, actually.
There's another illustration, I think it's vignette 4 of that same collection, where there's very exaggerated anatomy for the purpose of portraying the full act of sex that's taking place in an erotically pleasing way. And it's just surreal to see those kinds of artistic concerns that like modern Shota artists have, or any erotic artist, portrayed in a medieval piece. It's very funny.
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, both these illustrations in this book and also Shunga prints that I've seen in other books, I think that they are so... they don't do justice to the textual stories. It's of course only about how you read images, how they read them back then and how I read them now. I just don't find them attractive. But I guess the point with them was that they were attractive.
Yeah, definitely. It's hard to imagine what combination of sensory experiences would have formed that particular kind of drawing. I'm assuming at the time it was the hottest thing anyone had ever seen.
It was, and there is a book about Shunga specifically in the 18th century. It's called Sex and the Floating World or something like that. And I forgot his name now, I have the book. But Sex and the Floating World. But one of his points, and what made that book really famous and his research really famous, was that for the first time he said what no one had said before, which is that Shunga prints were used for masturbation. That was their main purpose. But that was just like Chigo Monogatari were not properly researched because of homophobia and CSA concerns. It was the same with Shunga prints. So yeah, it's fascinating when not even academics can just do proper research. Let's see, Timon Screech was his name, the author. Then maybe, do you want to add something more, Yat?
I think that covered all of my notes.
So in that case, because I didn't take so many notes, but I did lots of highlights, and then I tried to transfer those highlights into notes. But it's then I will try to wrap up by saying that I think that it's.
I have a question.
Yes, go on.
What is the painting you have like on your back, like in the wall?
This is Otto Müller. This is the artist that I referred to in my latest video about Destroyer. So this is Otto Müller, an artist who was banned by the Nazis in Germany in the 1940s.
Yeah, it's really cool. That's why I wanted to ask you about it.
Yeah, and he lived with gypsies and he painted them.
Really?
And yeah. So first of all, the reason why I read this book, or why I became aware of it, is that it was listed under my own book, Impossibly Cute Boys. It was listed as people who bought this book also bought this, or something like that. And that was so fun. And I thought, oh wow, so we have Impossibly Cute Boys, we have tales of idealized boys. It's really a genre, isn't it? So I would say that reading this, the main impression that it gave on me was that I think someone even wrote that in the initial book club chat, that it sort of shakes you up a bit because you realize how flexible people are, how flexible human desire is, and how, because this would be completely unthinkable in our society. Not that our society doesn't celebrate boys, it does completely, it just does it in a different way. But to see these relationships between boys aged around 12, 13, 14, 15 and men being institutionalized in the same way as marriage between men and women, it is hard to wrap your head around, because it is such a very stark contrast to our own society. Just like many historical aspects of various medieval countries or times are, of course. So there's nothing strange with that. But I think that in this case, the contrast is so extremely stark and the subject is so fascinating to read about that it's, I think it was a great book, and I will give it 5 out of 5. What would you give it, Yat?
I think so too. I think it did a good job translating the tales and getting across that this was a way of life that actually existed in an actual country.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I really liked all the summaries of the stories also, because I think that was it was necessary in order to, because you want as much as possible without reading the whole story. So yeah. Well, this was really fun because it was so improvised and without much of a structure from my side. But if you liked it, why don't we continue and read other books and talk about them in the lounge?
Yeah, I would love to. I would love
Yeah?
to.
Cool. Then
Yeah,
I will
definitely.
finish up. Yeah. It was really good to have you here, all of you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you. 1 hour sharp. That's perfect. See you.
See you.
Bye bye.
Bye. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day, you too. Bye.